There comes a moment in every inner journey when the pain of staying small becomes more unbearable than the fear of being alone. That moment, though it may come quietly in the stillness of a sleepless night, or explosively in the heat of betrayal, is not weakness. It is awakening. It is the first flicker of a buried truth surfacing. You were never meant to shrink in order to be loved. You see, love that requires you to dim your light, to silence your voice, to suppress your joy or tolerate disrespect, is not love at all. It is attachment dressed as devotion, need disguised as care. But the soul, in its deepest knowing, cannot be fooled forever. There's an instinct inside you that rebels when you're being asked to trade your self-respect for connection, and while you may silence that instinct for a time, because you fear loss, or because hope clings stubbornly to a fantasy, the soul keeps the score. It remembers every compromise you made just to feel wanted. It remembers every moment you abandon yourself for the illusion of closeness. It remembers, even if your mind tries to forget. When someone doesn't truly see you, when they consistently fail to meet your heart with reverence, it is not because you are hard to love, it is because they were never capable of holding the depth you carry. You must understand this deeply. People do not reject your worth. They reveal their limits. And when someone cannot meet you where you are, it is not your duty to descend in order to keep them company. That is not love. That is self-betrayal. To stay in a connection where you are undervalued is to silently tell yourself that this is the best you can get. That is the hidden message, repeated each time you forgive disrespect, rationalize neglect, or lower your standards to keep the peace. And the more you repeat it, the more it embeds itself in your psyche, until it begins to shape not just your relationships, but your self-concept. You become someone who tolerates being unseen, because you've forgotten how much light lives inside you. But the moment you decide to let go, truly let go, not out of bitterness, not as an act of revenge, but as a sacred declaration that you deserve more, that moment changes everything. That is not weakness, that is power, that is alignment. It is the point when the soul whispers, "Enough," and your entire being listens. In that moment, something ancient and true stirs within you, a remembrance, a return. Letting go of someone who never deserved you is not just the end of a relationship, it is the end of a lie. The lie that you were too much, or not enough, or somehow flawed in ways that made you unworthy of being cherished. No, what was flawed was the belief that love could only be earned by shrinking, pleasing, or staying silent. You were never meant to be loved conditionally. You were never meant to audition for affection. Your existence is not a performance to be judged. You are meant to be loved as you are, fully, fiercely, unapologetically. And if someone couldn't do that, it's not your failure, it's your signal to walk away with dignity. It is here, in the silence after goodbye, that something sacred begins, a new relationship, not with another, but with yourself. You begin to reclaim the energy you once gave away so freely. You begin to hear your own voice again, unfiltered by someone else's expectations. You begin to see yourself not as someone waiting to be chosen, but as someone who chooses themselves. And from this place, everything shifts. Because the truth is, you are never asking for too much. You are just asking the wrong person. And now that you've remembered who you are, you will never again trade your light for temporary warmth. You will never again confuse attention for love. You will never again settle for being tolerated when your soul came here to be celebrated. Letting go, then, is not defeat. It is liberation. It is the soul's quiet triumph over the noise of fear. It is the moment you return to yourself, not broken, but whole, not bitter, but wise, not empty, but full of something the other person could never give you, your own power. And from that place, you rise. There is a kind of love that costs far more than it gives. It's the kind that slowly convinces you to silence parts of yourself, to compromise your truth, to endure more than you ever should in the name of connection. But that kind of love, if it can be called love at all, is a cage. And the longer you stay in it, the more you forget that your soul was meant to soar. Real love is not supposed to feel like self-abandonment. Yet many find themselves trapped in relationships where every day becomes a quiet negotiation with their own authenticity. You start out by overlooking small things, a dismissive comment here, a broken promise there. You tell yourself they didn't mean it, or that love is supposed to be hard. But slowly, piece by piece, you chip away at your own needs just to keep the relationship intact. And by the time you realize what you've given up, it feels too late to turn back. You've built a life around someone who never truly saw you. But let's be honest with ourselves. What kind of love demands that you suppress your joy, your voice, your essence? That is not love. That is a form of spiritual erosion. When you find yourself constantly walking on eggshells, when your heart is filled more with anxiety than with peace, when you're giving endlessly and receiving crumbs in return, then what you're holding on to is not love, but fear. Fear of being alone, fear of starting over, fear of confronting the truth that you've outgrown someone who never knew how to grow with you. The tragedy is not that they couldn't love you the way you needed. The real tragedy is that you thought you had to change who you are just to be worthy of their affection. But you were never the problem. The problem was believing that love is something to earn through sacrifice. Love, real love, doesn't ask you to shrink, it asks you to rise. It doesn't ask for perfection, it asks for presence. And most of all, it doesn't ask you to betray yourself. When you stay in a relationship that requires you to betray your values, your boundaries, your voice, it drains the very life force that animates your being. And yet, the world has taught so many to endure rather than to walk away. It teaches you that staying is strength, that leaving is weakness. But sometimes, the strongest thing you can ever do is leave the table when love is no longer being served. There is a certain moment in life when the pain of staying finally outweighs the fear of letting go. And that moment is sacred. That moment marks the beginning of your return to yourself. It is a reawakening. You begin to realize that no amount of love you give will ever be enough for someone who does not value themselves, because they will never know how to value you. And it's not your job to fix that. It's not your role to sacrifice yourself trying to awaken someone else's heart. That is where the power of letting go reveals itself. When you stop trying to make it work, when you stop fighting for someone who won't even meet you halfway, you reclaim your energy, you reclaim your clarity, and most importantly, you reclaim your self-respect. What you couldn't see while you were wrapped in the pain of holding on becomes blindingly clear in the quiet that follows your release. You were never asking for too much. You were just asking someone who wasn't capable of giving. The beauty of letting go is that it doesn't just free you from the other person, it frees you from the false version of yourself you became in order to be loved. You begin to remember who you were before the compromise, before the anxiety, before the constant questioning of your worth. You begin to hear your own voice again. And what it tells you is this: love should never cost yourself. To love yourself enough to walk away from what doesn't serve you is not selfish, it's sacred. It is the beginning of true love, not the end of it. Because real love starts within, and when you no longer abandon yourself for the sake of another, you create space for the kind of love that doesn't diminish you, but reflects your wholeness back to you. You don't have to keep choosing pain to prove that you're loyal. You're allowed to choose peace. And sometimes, choosing peace means finally letting go. There is something profoundly healing that happens the moment you choose to let go of someone who never truly valued you. At first it feels like emptiness, a silence you're not used to, a strange kind of quiet where once there was noise, distraction, tension. And it's easy to mistake that silence for loneliness, easy to think that something's missing. But in truth, that space is sacred. That space is the beginning of your return to wholeness. Because when you are entangled in a relationship where your worth is questioned, where your soul is denied the room to breathe, you lose yourself in ways that aren't always visible. You lose your voice in the constant over-explaining. You lose your joy in the overthinking. You lose your boundaries in the name of keeping the peace. Over time, the person you were becomes a faint echo, distant, almost unrecognizable, and yet you stay. Not because you're weak, but because your hope was stronger than your pain. You believed that if you just loved a little harder, gave a little more, endured a little longer, it would be enough. But some people don't change. Some people aren't ready to meet you in the depth you offer. And so, there comes a moment, not loud or dramatic, but calm and undeniable, when you realize that holding on is costing you more than letting go ever will. That moment is not loss, it is clarity. It is the beginning of something far greater than just walking away. It is the start of your spiritual realignment, a return to the self that's been waiting patiently behind all the noise, waiting to be heard again. When you finally release the person who couldn't see you, something within you begins to come alive again. It doesn't happen all at once. Healing rarely does. But you notice small shifts. Your breath deepens, your mind quiets, your heart softens. That pain you thought would destroy you becomes a teacher. It shows you where you gave away your power, where you confused love with tolerance, where you accepted less because you forgot what more felt like. And now, in their absence, there is space, not just the physical absence of their presence, but the emotional space where your energy is no longer being drained. You are no longer locked in the cycle of trying to fix what was never your responsibility. You are no longer bound by the anxiety of walking on eggshells or bracing for the next moment of disappointment. That mental noise starts to fade, and in its place, silence blooms, and from that silence the voice of your soul returns. This is the spiritual gift of letting go. It creates the room for healing, for remembering, for coming back into alignment with who you truly are. It is not just about removing someone from your life. It's about removing the version of you that existed in their shadow. It's about stepping back into the light of your own truth, the version of you that is not afraid to take up space, not afraid to speak without being dismissed, not afraid to be alone because you now understand that being alone is not the same as being empty. In fact, it is often in the aloneness that we meet ourselves most clearly. So many fear letting go because they fear the void. But the void is not the enemy. The void is where creation begins. It is the womb of transformation. What feels like nothingness is actually the fertile ground of rebirth. You have cleared the field. You have pulled out the weeds. Now the soil of your soul is ready to grow something real, something rooted in mutual respect, honesty, and love that nourishes instead of drains. You don't need to rush to fill the space that letting go has opened. Let it be empty for a while. Let it echo. Let it breathe. Because in that sacred stillness, the real work begins. Not of chasing a new connection, but of reconnecting with your own spirit. And from that place of fullness, you will no longer settle. You will no longer beg to be seen. You will no longer hand over your peace just to avoid being alone. Letting them go was never about them. It was always about you. About finally choosing yourself. About returning to the self that was buried under years of trying to be enough for someone who couldn't recognize your value. And in choosing yourself, you've begun a new kind of relationship. One that doesn't begin in compromise, but in truth. Because their absence isn't a loss. It's the opening your soul has been waiting for. When you finally let go of someone who never deserved you, something deep within you begins to shift. At first the change is subtle, almost imperceptible. A bit more silence in the morning, a new kind of stillness in your body, the absence of that constant tension in your chest, the weight that sat on your shoulders for far too long. But over time, that stillness begins to speak, and what it tells you is this: there was never anything wrong with you. You were simply trying to bloom in soil that could not nourish you. You begin to realize how much of your identity had been shaped by the struggle to be loved by someone incapable of meeting you where you are. You start to see how often you dimmed your light to avoid making someone else feel insecure, how often you softened your voice so they wouldn't feel small. And now, with them gone, you begin to feel the return of something sacred, your own wholeness. It's strange how pain can mask your truth. When you are constantly trying to hold a relationship together, your focus narrows. You become consumed with what's wrong, what needs fixing, what you must do to make it better. And in that endless loop of fixing and adjusting, you forget the truth of your being. You forget that you are never broken, that your worth was never tied to their ability to see it. Their inability to love you was never a mirror of your inadequacy. It was a reflection of their own inner limits. But now, in the quiet aftermath of release, you have room to remember. You begin to reconnect with the parts of yourself that had been put on pause, the dreams you silenced, the desires you buried, the voice you held back. All of these things begin to stir again, slowly waking from their slumber. It feels fragile at first, this reconnection, like touching something delicate after a long time. But with every breath, it grows stronger, and as it grows, you begin to notice a new kind of strength rising within you. Not the strength that comes from enduring, but the strength that comes from knowing who you are, without needing anyone's permission. Letting go doesn't just free you from the relationship, it frees you from the roles you unconsciously agreed to play: the caretaker, the fixer, the forgiver, the one who always understood, even when you were the one hurting. And now, you don't have to perform anymore. You don't have to carry someone else's emotional weight. You can just be. And in that being, you begin to heal. This healing is not always loud. It doesn't always look like radical transformation. Sometimes it looks like crying in your car. Sometimes it looks like sitting in silence with no urge to speak. Sometimes it looks like walking alone, not because you're lonely, but because you're learning to enjoy your own company again. And in those small, quiet moments, you begin to feel yourself returning, fully, honestly, deeply. You realize that the love you were searching for in them, the safety you craved, the understanding you longed for, it's all been waiting for you within yourself. And as you begin to give those things to yourself, the void begins to fill, not with distractions or temporary pleasures, but with something real. You start to create your own peace. You start to anchor yourself in your own presence. You no longer need someone to complete you because you understand now that you were never incomplete. And then one day, without fanfare or announcement, you'll wake up and realize that the pain is no longer the loudest voice in the room. It will still be there, like a scar on the soul, but it won't define you. You'll carry it with dignity, not as a reminder of what you lost, but as a testament to what you found. The version of yourself who no longer begs to be loved, who no longer accepts being overlooked, who no longer mistakes suffering for loyalty. That is the quiet power of letting go. It doesn't scream. It doesn't chase. It simply honors what is no longer aligned and makes room for what is. And what is coming, what will grow in that open space, is not a return to what was, but a rebirth of what has always lived within you, waiting to be remembered. Because the truth is, you never really lost them, you just found yourself. There is a moment in your healing when you finally begin to realize that their inability to love you had nothing to do with your worth. That moment doesn't arrive all at once. It comes slowly, like sunlight creeping through the cracks of a tightly closed window. At first, it's hard to believe. For so long, you had carried the weight of being not enough. You wore it like a second skin, invisible perhaps to others, but heavy and suffocating to your spirit. He thought if he had just been a little more patient, a little more understanding, a little more quiet, a little more something, then maybe they would have stayed, or seen you clearly, or loved you the way you needed to be loved. But the truth is this: people can only meet you as deeply as they've met themselves. And if they have not faced their own shadows, if they have not done the inner work to hold space for vulnerability, for presence, for intimacy, then they are not capable of offering you the kind of love that heals. It doesn't mean they are evil or bad. It means they are limited. And the tragedy is not in their inability to love, but in your decision to interpret their limits as your inadequacy. Now, as you step away from that relationship, something remarkable begins to happen. The fog starts to lift. You begin to hear yourself again, clearly and without distortion. You begin to question the old narratives that were planted in your heart, not by malice, but by ignorance. You start to look back and realize how much you shrunk yourself, how much you twisted and contorted just to keep the connection alive, and slowly the story begins to change. You're no longer the one who wasn't enough. You're the one who kept showing up, who kept giving, who kept loving in spite of being met with emotional poverty. This shift in perspective is not just intellectual, it's spiritual. Because when you finally recognize that your worth was never dependent on their recognition, you reclaim a part of yourself that was long forgotten. You stop needing closure. You stop waiting for apologies. You stop chasing validation in the rearview mirror. You simply begin to stand in the truth of your own being. And in that truth, something sacred stirs. You find that the need to prove yourself fades. You no longer need to explain your heart to someone who was never listening in the first place. You don't need to justify your pain or argue your value. Your dignity becomes your own quiet anchor, and that is a kind of freedom that no one can give you, and no one can take away. It's not that you stop loving them. Love doesn't vanish so easily. But the love you once gave so freely to someone who couldn't receive it, you now begin to pour back into yourself. You start to nourish your own soul with the gentleness you always offered to others. You begin to speak to yourself in kinder tones, to treat your wounds with patience instead of judgment. And through that self-compassion, you discover a love far more profound than anything they could have given you. A love rooted in truth, in self-respect, in wholeness. This journey is not without pain. There are days when the memories return like waves crashing hard against the shore. But even in those moments, you're different now. You know the wave will pass. You know you won't drown in it. Because you've remembered something essential. You were never broken. You were never too difficult to love. You were never too difficult to love. You simply loved someone who was not capable of receiving all that you are. That knowing becomes your strength. It guides you forward. It teaches you to choose differently next time, to listen more closely to the quiet voice within, to honor red flags, to trust your gut, to wait for the one who sees you not as someone to fix or control or mold, but someone to cherish, to respect, and to meet as an equal. What you've gained in letting them go is far greater than anything you lost. You've gained clarity. You've gained your voice. You've gained yourself. And that is more than enough. It's only when you truly let go, when you surrender not just the person, but the idea of what could have been, that you begin to create space for what's meant for you. There's something sacred in that emptiness. It can feel like loss at first, like standing in the ruins of something you built with your bare hands. You look around and see memories scattered like ashes. You remember the hopes, the promises, the quiet moments that once made your heart believe. But as the dust settles, you begin to feel something else rising. Not sadness, not longing, but possibility. The truth is, most people fear emptiness. They rush to fill it. They reach for distractions, new connections, temporary highs, anything to avoid sitting in the space that the absence creates. But if you can resist that urge, if you can sit still, breathe deeply, and let the silence speak, you will hear something profound. That space is not a void. It is the sacred ground upon which new life grows. It is the space where the soul expands. It is the threshold between who you were and who you're becoming. Letting go is not just about closing a chapter. It's about allowing a new one to begin, even if you don't know what it holds yet. When you release someone who never truly deserved you, you're not just walking away from pain. You are walking towards something higher. You are creating room for alignment, for truth, for relationships that mirror your growth, not your wounds, for love that feels like peace, not survival. And as you begin to walk this new path, you realize that everything you went through wasn't in vain. The pain shaped you. The heartbreak opened your eyes. The loss deepened your capacity for empathy, for compassion, for presence. You're no longer seeking love from a place of desperation. You're no longer begging for crumbs. You're no longer trying to convince someone to choose you. You've learned that your heart is not a battlefield. It is a sacred space, and only those who can honor its depth are welcome now. There will be days when the old feelings return, days when you wonder if you made the right choice, when your mind replays the good moments and conveniently forgets the rest. That's natural. Healing isn't linear. But even in those moments of nostalgia, there is a deeper knowing within you now, one that whispers, you did not walk away from love, you walked away from illusion. And that knowing becomes your compass. You start to attract different energy, people who see you not as someone to fix or save, but as someone to respect and understand. You begin to speak differently, with more authority and less fear. You make decisions based on your values, not your loneliness. You set boundaries, not as walls to keep others out, but as gates that honor your worth. And with each step forward, you realize you are not becoming someone new. You are returning to who you were before you were taught to doubt yourself. And the letting go, then, becomes not just a moment of release, but a sacred initiation, a turning point in the soul's evolution. Where once you were entangled in someone else's chaos, now you are grounded in your own clarity. Where once you tried to be what they needed, now you choose to be who you are. And in doing so, you become a magnet, not for attention, but for authenticity. Not for noise, but for depth. Not for fleeting connections, but for soul recognition. This is what it means to rise. To leave behind what is not yours. To stop trying to rewrite someone else's story. To stand in your own narrative with pride and peace. Because you finally understand that your time, your love, your energy, they are sacred offerings, and not every